Signals live, so we'll get started in a second.
What?
I said the signal's live. So
Yeah, that's what it
these
is.
conversations. Signal's live, so you might want to conclude any inappropriate conversations. That was a joke, by the way. Anything that you don't want the rest of the world hearing. He's here.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's not my real laugh. Thank you.
Testing, 1, 2. Testing, 1, 2.
What is that? The understatement of the
I'm sorry, can you go like 3-0 in like 3 minutes? Like that, like, bro. That's fine. I'm so done. You're talking about points to it. Bro, look, it's yeah. Not even joking.
Yeah. Okay. Let them know it's 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
That's why you're not eating? Yeah.
I guess to say thank you guys for Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming today. My name is Aminata Sinyan. I'm one of the co-event chairs here at the Johns Hopkins University Muslim Association. And thank you for taking time out of your day to make it here to FastForward you. I know it was a mission for some, but thank you all for being here. And if you haven't already, you can help yourself to food over there to my left. And the restrooms are back there. And just enjoy the night. So before we get started, I would like to introduce Imam Earl. And as an adolescent, Earl Abdulmalik Mohammed embraced the teaching of Islam under Imam W.D. Mohammed's leadership. In the mid-1980s, he was qualified and was recognized as an imam or religious leader and was asked to lead mosques in Florida, Texas, and Maryland. By 1990, at 25 years old, he had become the national representative of Imam W.D. Mohammed, representing him and the Muslim American community to national media organizations on college campuses and at domestic and international gatherings with noted religious and social organizations and leaders. In 1996, Mohammed played a central role in facilitating the historical meeting between Pope John Paul II and Imam W.D. Mohammed at the Vatican. In 2001, speaking at the Communities Convention, National Convention, Imam W. Dean at the Vatican, Imam W. Dean said of him, "I must acknowledge the man who has done more than any other person to help me get the correct image of Muslims and Imam W. Dean Mohammed to the public of America and the world, Earl Abdulmalik Mohammed." In 2003, Imam W. Dean Mohammed separated his ministry from the American Society of Muslims, and in 2008 he passed away, having formally named no successor. As early as 2010, there were signs that major mosques in his following and leaders in every city in America had begun to drift away from the traditional emphasis taught by him for lack of a central public message. In 2006, sensing the trouble in the Muslim community following to which he belonged, and with the dramatic world rise of unprecedented extremism associated with Islam, Imam Earl Abdulmalik Mohammed published Democracy, Civic Virtue, and Islam, the Muslim American Jihad Against Extremism, to a worldwide distribution and international acclaim. The book expertly countered the narratives and condemned the actions of so-called Muslims extremists as blatantly un-Islamic. Inspired by the impact of the book, a group of persons representing many U.S. cities began to coalesce around Imam Mohammed, encouraging the voice of leadership. The groups recognized that his unique ideology discipline represented the continuation of the tradition that began with Elijah Muhammad and W.D. Muhammad, and they began to publicly promote and support him as the next leader of the Muslim American community. Muhammad wrote a second book in 2019 on Nature and Nations, the Muslim American Message for Humanity in the Day of Religions, and then founded the Muslim American Ministry for Human Salvation, a nonprofit charitable organization. With widening public recognition, Imam Earl Abdulmalik Mohammed and his supporters have pronounced America's oldest tradition of Islamic leadership and public engagement. I would like to hand over the mic to Brother Imam.
peace be on you. As we greet each other, as Muslims greet each other. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
It is my great honor to visit you here on this campus. I believe this is part of the campus. Maybe 35 years ago, I spoke on this campus representing Imam W.D. Mohammed. The first time that he sent me to represent him in his absence. He was invited, and he wasn't able to be there. And he sent me. I don't recall what the presentation was that evening. I recall the setting, but I don't recall the topic. But what I do recall is that someone in that audience was not pleased with me being there representing him. And they found something in that presentation to identify as a deviation from him, from his emphasis, his teaching at that time. I don't know what it was. But they reported this to him, and I'm sure in hopes to get me in some kind of trouble. So he called me. I was living in Chicago, not far from his office. His office was in his daughter's house in the basement. And he called me and he said, Abdulmalik, he said, I want you to come and meet me at the office at such and such time. And that wasn't ordinary for him. That was something out of the ordinary. If I was to meet him, he would just show up at the office while I was already there. He gave me a specific time to be there. And I didn't know what the situation was, but I could hear in his voice that it was of some concern. So I got there, and as I was parking in the front of the house, he stepped out on the porch or landing, and he gestured to me to come into the house, on the upper part of the house, the living area of the house, which was very unusual. And he said, my daughter, she's not here right now. He said, so we'll just talk here in the living room. So I sat there next to him, and I could see that whatever it is that I was concerned about, or maybe even worried about, he was making me feel very comfortable and making me feel that there was no issue, no trouble. Just talking normally about some office matters or some something going on that he wanted me to be aware of. And then he said, I had this cassette tape. He said, it's of you. And he said, it's your speech at Johns Hopkins University. And he smiled. He said, you know, you are a combination of me and my father. He said, but you're too young to have known my father. You know his father, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. He said, but you know him better than most of his ministers knew him. So, whatever it is that that person who sent that tape to him wanted to create as a problem for me. It didn't work out. And it took me maybe 25 years, or 30 years maybe, to really appreciate and understand what he was telling me that day. And what he was telling me was that he was officially inviting me into the leadership of his father by associating me with him and his father. Now, I say that to you all this evening to put myself at ease. And the content of what I want to present to you is something to be presented by persons having a sensitivity for where this community that was led by Elijah Muhammad and Wallace D. Muhammad, or rather D. Muhammad, where it should go. How our life was constructed, for what purposes, and what focus we should have presently going forward. Now, I'm no scholar, and this is an academic setting, and I appreciate Dr. Fatima Fanusi. I don't know if she's here. Yes. She encouraged this occasion and encouraged the organizers to consider me and encourage me as well. What I present to you today or tonight is not the reflections of an academic or a scholar. It is references to the deforming of a people and a strategy to reform them for God's purpose as a spiritual community, carrying in its experience evidence of the working of the will of God. I'm not presenting to you, or don't intend to present to you, a history of Islam in America, addressing all of the various iterations of that history. I understand my purpose here to introduce to you and to speak to you about the community that began with the strategy and the planning of a stranger, a foreigner, that came here with the express purpose of identifying a people and putting them, or identifying people who have been stripped of their dignity, their inherent human identity, and to give them a new life, a new perspective, a new clothing, if you might accept that reference that comes from the Quran. God says in the Quran to the children of Adam to honor their blessing of clothing that God has sent down to them, the blessing of clothing. And he says that the clothing of righteousness, or taqwa, regardfulness, is the best clothing. A reference to your original human dignity, your original human design, in the next verse, in Quran says, and do not let the enemy, your enemy, the arch enemy of mankind, Shaitan or Satan, do not permit him to remove you from that. And the Bible asks the question of Adam, who told you that you were naked? Who told you that you were naked? In other words, something is belonging to the human life and the human form that God intended for it to have and benefit from. And what that is his will and his spirit working in that form. The human identity is sacred. But to load it up or put upon it lies deforms it. And so the people who were enslaved by these United States of America were a people victimized by the ideas to breed into them inferiority. Lies about their worth, their value, that was intended to dismiss their claim as human beings. In fact, the language of this defamation was permitted even in the documents that support the logic of the systems of government themselves. Slaves were thought of by way of legal interpretation and language as a percentage of human, 3/5 of human. And even the Supreme Court of the United States of America at that time, in one legal decision, said that the black people of America had no rights that the white people should respect. Mr. W.D. Farrar, who was thought of and taught and was presented by his following, and he influenced them to present him this way. I don't know that he actually told them to say this, but they presented him this way, that he was God in the flesh. So we know just from that he wasn't offering them religion. He wasn't giving them from Islam as religion or system of faith. That's not what he was doing. He was introducing to them identity. And not necessarily emphasizing religious identity, but emphasizing human identity. And this is what Muhammad the Prophet left us, that every human being is born upon the natural design or fitra. Every human being shares these characteristics. And the learned people in Islam, they will interpret this to be a direct reference to Muslim identity. So it can be said by reasoning that Prophet Muhammad, the prayers and peace be on him, he said that every child is born Muslim upon the nature, upon the natural pattern. Mr. Farrar's reference was to identify those people that he came to in their original value, and to have them identify with it in the context of Islamic identity or Muslim identity. So if we follow this, we understand this logic, we understand that to say Muslim identity, the first meaning of that is human identity. The most essential meaning of Muslim identity is human identity. And so, Mr. Farad, he taught his students, and the most well-known and celebrated of those students, Elijah Muhammad, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, that what is your true self? This was a question, and with the answer to it. This is one of the catechism. Ask a question and then there's an answer. What is your true self? Or who is your true self? And the answer for the Nation of Islam following was your true self is a righteous Muslim. So here is a strategy that is appealing to emphasizing the value of the worth of what God created when he created a human being. And that whatever he created in that human being, or for that human being, all human beings identifying in that picture are entitled to enjoy whatever he intended. This is the foundation of the influence that led that community to mature into what we have become today. A Muslim community identifying in the following, international following of Muhammad the Prophet, embracing teachings of the Holy Quran in its best interpretations, identifying in the brotherhood of the fraternal order of Muslims without emphasis on race or culture or language, identifying in the richness and beauty and diversity of the human family. This is who we are today. Coming from that strategy of Mr. Farad. He said too, he left this as an influence. You will not speak well until you put your mathematical ideology in its proper terms, or mathematical terminology in its proper terms. This is what he told his father, or told his students. In other words, he was telling them that what you have been given is not in its proper terms. And by way of interpretation, the details of his teaching must be interpreted, must be unraveled, must be studied deeply in order to reveal the true meanings, in order to appreciate its potency and its direction. That responsibility couldn't be handled by any random individual. He invited someone to assist his father. He invited someone to assist his student, Elijah Muhammad, in that interpretation, and that was Elijah Muhammad's son, Wallace D. Muhammad, who's named after Mr. Farad. Mr. Farad, he had many names: W.F. Muhammad, Walid Farad Muhammad, Wallace D. Farad, Wallace D. Muhammad, and so on. And each of these names, nothing that he said or left was without meaning. All of these names and representations of himself all had importance and all had important meaning in the context of his plan. the iconic personality that most of you all are familiar with, I'm sure. Like Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali, two persons that most of you all here are familiar with. Malcolm X, right? And Muhammad Ali, formerly before that Cassius Clay, heavyweight champion of the world, heavyweight boxing champion. We know of them because of how they were shaped and the change that came over them that redefines their existence, redefine their language, redefine their image. In the telling of Muhammad Ali, his own words, and also in the words of Malcolm X, they were themselves victims of white supremacist America, viewing themselves as America under the influence of white supremacy viewed them. And the influence of Elijah Muhammad, the emphasis on Muslim identity, the emphasis on human identity, the emphasis on what you're entitled to as a human being. Even though it was couched in the language that others might refer to as racist, it was a counter to the claim of the white race as being superior. It was a way to address the imbalance in that influence and the attempt to deform an innocent human existence, an innocent human life. So Honorable Elijah Muhammad, in his language and appeal, reflecting the teaching of his teacher, he reached the mind and the spirit and the sensitivities of Malcolm X, Malcolm Little. He reached Cassius Clay. And by way of that influence, they had language and emphasis and understanding of their worth and purpose. They were reformed as human beings, and they became the great figures that we know now. Now, this is African American History Month, and I know that this program, the occasion for this program is that this is African American History Month, and it's important in acknowledging that month and the special personalities that we acknowledge that are associated with this month. Think of Malcolm X, we think of Muhammad Ali, but not many of us think of Elijah Muhammad, because what we associate with him is some distance away from Islamic teaching. But if we interpret his importance in the context of the plan of his teacher to bring that deformed people to a relationship with their God-given integrity and dignity, and if we interpret it in the context of the introduction to the Holy Quran into their life, then we will recognize that Elijah Muhammad is a giant. Because he left the responsibility to build the Nation of Islam. I mean, Mr. Farad left the responsibility to build the Nation of Islam to Elijah Muhammad. The plan was executed through Elijah Muhammad's leadership. And so, I don't believe that it's proper that we have these recognitions during the month of February or African American History Month so much emphasis is placed on Malcolm X in the context of Islamic representation, and no attention is given to Elijah Muhammad. Very little attention. And as time goes on, we have to be a factor. You all who are listening to me today have to be a factor to correct that. And in correcting that, you also, it follows then that his son and his role, that is the son of Elijah Muhammad, that is Muhammad, and his role will also be reflected upon. It's not just my responsibility, but if you all are hearing me and appreciating what I'm presenting to you, it becomes your responsibility too. In the same way that we would honor the great and influential leaders who shaped Islamic identity of other civilizations of people, the same way that we appreciate their influence, we appreciate their leadership. When we look at Islam in America, we have to appreciate those that shaped the life and made way for all of us to enjoy Islamic freedoms and benefit from our American citizenship without making little of our Islamic life. It's because of the leadership of these persons that we have these freedoms that we have now, this kind of respect that we have on these college campuses. In the Republic of America, endowed programs and chairs on these college campuses because of the influence of these leaders that shape the identity of a people, and a whole community of Muslims in America are studied as a focus for how Islam can grow in a pluralistic society because of their influence. And so you have scholars like Dr. Khanusi, who has devoted much of her life to the study of Mr. Faraj's influence. And her work is respected on these campuses. And her word is respected, or else I wouldn't be here. So, when we're speaking of the African American history of Muslims in America, we're speaking of the movement to interpret Islam as a body of teaching and moral influence to reform the whole world's thinking about the value of a human person. If we want to study the role of Islam in America and appreciate it in its proper context, it must be understood by looking carefully at this people that had been deformed and oppressed and separated from their identity, and how Islamic teaching and influence reshaped them and brought from them a spiritual community that delivered into the ears of the world, into the conscience of the world, a new appreciation for human work. There is a story in the Quran where a mother has devoted the unborn life in her womb to the devotion and will of God. And this special fruit of her womb, this mother, after she's born, she is highly respected and regarded by her religious community. They know that the mother has devoted her and positioned her for a special purpose. So they provide for her to be in a setting where the influences of the world are not reaching her. They're not shaping her. She's only shaped by that devotion that her mother placed upon her. So she's in an environment that is special for her, protected. And those who are respected and honored and held up for their knowledge to advance righteousness in the world are also charged with the responsibility to protect this human being that I'm speaking of. This is a story for reference to Mary, or Maria, the mother of Jesus, peace be on the cross, and the devotion of her mother to her. This is speaking of Maria, her mother. Her mother devoted the birth of the unborn child to the devotion of God. I'm sure that Mr. W.D. Farad knew this story, and it influenced him. The Nation of Islam membership was essentially a language environment. And the creation of a reality about the world, what the world was, and what African American people were, was preserved in that environment. And influences from the world were shut down and prevented. In other words, you could not tell a member of the Nation of Islam that their reality of what the world was could be corrected by or influenced by what the true reality of the world, because their language environment didn't support that. The American construct said that the descendants of Europe that founded America were the superior, were the entitled, were the owners and the makers. The Nation of Islam said the opposite. That the black man was the owner, the maker, the father of civilization, the cream of humanity. And that God favored them above all others, that they were the chosen. Everything that white supremacist America said about the worth of the blacks, or lack of worth of the blacks, was countered, point by point, by the Nation of Islam language environment. In the story in the Quran of Mary, says that her caretaker, who was the high priest of the order of their religious community, or spiritual community, Zachariah, would visit her, and every time he visited her, she was already provided for. Whatever her needs were already provided for. There was nothing that he could offer her that was already not given to her. The way that Mr. Farad positioned the membership of the Nation of Islam through his teaching was that every necessary provision, everything that is needed to establish yourself, to establish your life, to establish your community, has been provided for you in the Nation of Islam language environment. And at the most respected influence in that language environment, the most respected, the most honored influence in that language environment was a reference to the Word of God, taught that the Quran, the Word of God revealed to Muhammad the Prophet, should be in the most special, highest place in the home. This is what he taught. And if you walk into a home of a member of the Nation of Islam in those years, you go into their home and wherever the highest point in the home, the highest bookshelf or the highest place in the house, the Quran would be there. This is a strong influence in the spiritual nature of their family and in the language environment of the Nation of Islam. So this is shaping a people, no different from the story that's given in the Quran of a spiritual community from which is produced a figure that is associated with the Word, the Spirit of God, and as a sign of God's authority and command. Jesus Christ. Peace be on the prophet, the Son of Man. This is what he's a sign of. This is what the Quran said. So here is Mr. W.D. Farad introducing a language environment and restricting that environment, making it so compelling that members of the Nation of Islam accepted no reality except the Nation of Islam teaching reality. Preserving them in that environment, focusing their attention on the influence of God's Word, for what purpose? That they will eventually, in time, through processes, produce a spiritual community of people devoted to God's command, devoted to God's will, not only to establish themselves or to bring them into a place of value and worth in the world, but to serve the life of mankind, to be a support, to be an example in the life of mankind. The people who are denied their humanity eventually come to have a greater appreciation for the worth of their humanity. And if they are inspired and complimented or desire the compliment of the support of God's Word and recognize the working of God's will, then as God says in the Quran, when I have breathed into him of my spirit, make such to him, speaking to the angels. A spiritual community, a community safeguarded from the influences of the world by a special language environment that feeds their life, that focuses their attention eventually on God's Word as a complement to their nature, eventually in the planning of Mr. Farad, eventually will become a community that is an example of the working of the Spirit of God and God's will, so as to bring humanity back to the correct picture of the creation of human beings and creation of human purpose. That is the history of Islam in America, among the African Americans. And the figures that we mentioned, not least of them, and perhaps most important of them, Imam Earl Mohammed, who was charged with the responsibility to introduce the proper reading of the Quran, to introduce it, to explain it, and to guarantee a kind of autonomy for his people, that in their spirit they would not be intimidated by the failings of the Muslim world, by the shortcomings of the Muslim world, by the fears of the Muslim world, but would register that their interpretation of Muslim life or Islamic life would be a factor for bringing again the spirit of productivity and righteousness to the Muslim world that had been lost. that through this process, not just bring a people to Islamic identity, but would renew, reform Islamic identity. This was Mr. Faraj's plan, and this was Imam W.D. Muhammad's work. Now, maybe you want to accept my conclusions, but understand that I have no mission except the mission that I was invited to when I spoke at this school 30-some years ago by Imam W. Muhammad, when he told me that I, to him, was a combination of him and his father. I have no mission except to introduce to you the true life of our people, the African American Muslim community in these United States of America, and its role, and what it is determined to do. By way of this influence and this teaching, an appreciation for the focus of the founders of the United States of America is keen and clear. That when the founders of the United States of America put in their founding documents that the order that they wanted to construct, the intent of that order was to pay respect to the dignity of the human person. It says in its words of Thomas Jefferson, Declaration of Independence, says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all human beings, or all men, as he said, are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The very language itself, if you look at it and analyze it through the lens of Islamic influence, you'll find that to arrive at what the rights are of a human person are derived from a study of the human self. We come to be aware of our dignity because of the recognition of God's will working in the human person. And eventually, recognition and understanding of that brings the human person to want to guarantee that status for all human beings in human society. No different from the statement in the Quran, Sa'atul Yadini Hanifan Fitratullah Lati Fatara Nasa Alayha. So set your dignified purpose, your inherent purpose, that which dignifies you originally as a human being upon the pattern that God established. That pattern, when it is manifest, becomes the pattern for human society. Fatara Nasa Alayha. Human society is patterned upon it. Patterned upon what? Recognition of the original human worth. That recognition on the part of the African American Muslim intellect is singularly powerful as a liberating agent for all oppressed people, including oppressed people in the Muslim world. That's enough. I think that, I have some other things I could say, but, I'm satisfied. I'm satisfied that my teachers and people that I come here to represent in our tradition, community of people that I'm here representing, that they're satisfied that I have done the job. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Imam Earl, for giving your speech here today. And I would also like to thank those that came with you helping set this up as well. And thank you everyone for received the entire duration of your speech. And we'll be praying by 8:30 Isha. So we'd also like to say we're praying right here. And one last reminder that we're having our helping hand volunteering tomorrow at 5 to 8 p.m. and we'll have 4 hop bands. So if you're registered, that's the only way that you can come with us. Yeah, just a reminder. But thank you so much, everyone, and have a good rest of your night. Sorry, everyone.
Just press and hold it.
Yeah, I think it's okay. Sorry. Before we start our prayer, if you guys would like to if you guys have any questions for Brother Imam Earl here, you can ask away. Sorry.
That's the part I enjoy most.
There's a question.
Yes.
Thank you so much for being here. I have a question about how you were raised and how you were introduced to Islam.
That's a good question. Thank you. My family, I would call them typical American or African American Christians. And by typical, I mean having an awareness of what is required to be a decent person, and associating that with belief in God, but not having any particular religious association or religious community association, and open to whatever is a positive influence. That was the spirit in the home that I grew up in. But my grandfather, my mother's father, he was someone that was interested in the world and interested in answering the problem for the condition of the African American people. You know, he was an uneducated person. I think he had maybe 5 or 6 years of education. He was an avid reader and took note of movements in history that were like liberation movements. And in his reading, he learned of the Nation of Islam as a young man. And he didn't have any situation to join the Nation of Islam, but he made himself aware of it, and he read the newspaper that was published by the Nation of Islam, and also he read the articles of Elijah Muhammad in the Pittsburgh Courier newspaper. When I was maybe 5 years would read to me from the Pittsburgh Courier newspaper, Mr. Muhammad Speaks. That was the name of the article. And I remember, I don't remember all the details, but I remember Mr. Muhammad Speaks. And it was such a rich and compelling memory for me that I thought I dreamt it. So I asked my mother about it, and she confirmed it. She told me that that your grandfather, he would sit you on his knee and he would read to you Mr. Muhammad Speaks. So I'm sure that that influenced my young mind. And when I was about 14 years old, my father had a lot of books in the house. He left a lot of literature laying around the house, about the African American enlightenment movement, freedom movement, So books with socialist influence, Black Panthers, and Du Bois, The Soul of Black Folk, and Booker T. Washington, Up from Slavery, all these books. So they just seemed to randomly appear around the house, So I decided I was going to start to read some of these books, and I began to read. And one of those books was Message to the Black Man, Black Muhammad. So I read that and read all these other books. And one day, something touched me, and I announced it to my parents. I was 14 years old. I announced to them I wanted to be a Muslim. It was on a Sunday. And my father said, he said, I know somebody. He called the person that day. That person came to the house and took me to the masjid. And I listened to the ta'aleem, the address at the masjid. And I don't remember what was said, but I had already made up my mind what I wanted to do. And so I made the Chinese person who took me, he left me. He took me to the masjid and left me there. He didn't stay with me. And when he came back to get me, he told me, how was it? And I told him, I said, I made the child. He said, you what? What? You understand what you did? I said, thinking to myself, that's the whole purpose for me going, in my mind. So when I got back to the house, I told my parents. They were not having any problem with it whatsoever. Almost as if there was a plan in mind. And to this day, I'm sure that they was watching. This is reaching, if it's on YouTube or whatever it is, my parents are watching. So that's been almost 50 years. So that's my background. Like most African American people, coming from Christian association and recognizing the value of Islamic teaching and making a conversion to that. And I have 14 children. It's hard to beat. And they are Muslims. Praise be to Allah. So all of my parents' grandchildren are Muslims and great-grandchildren. I had some grandchildren too. All Muslims. So thank Allah for that. I have 8 more minutes. All right. Yes.
Okay, hi. So we hear a lot about how Islam affected like the African American community in the United States Malcolm X and like the Nation of Islam. But do you think that you can speak towards like how Islam affected African Americans like culturally in the United States?
Culture. Well, a news report asked the Honorable Elijah Muhammad about his work. And he said putting my people in a new dress, new way of thinking, new language, and even different expressions culturally. So, clothing is symbolic of what is inherent, internal in the human life that is expressed in the world. And I would say the taste in food also is a reflection of movement and intelligence of people, a movement in their intelligence, all right? It is said that human beings got closer to what we consider to be civilized when they started to cook their food and season their food, all right? So, certainly, the African American Muslim community has influenced the tastes of American culture. Not just African American culture, but the taste in American culture. Elijah Muhammad, he put his name to a book called How to Eat to Live, which, without looking at the details of the book, it was him addressing the dietary habits of his own people, but in so doing, influencing their taste. The dress of the members of the Nation of Islam, men and women, was an influence on the community pride of the African American community. They were easily and readily recognizable in neighborhoods. So, if you follow the logical progression of that, the attention that African Americans now give to African culture had to have been connected to and perhaps solely inspired by the influence of the community of Muslims in America that awakened consciousness, a new consciousness to consider a new identity, a new life, not given by America, not endorsed by America, but reflecting who you are inherently and in an autonomous way. So I'm sure that much has been written, and there's will be more discussion about the influence of the African American Muslim community on music, clothing, food, all manner of cultural expressions, even the use of language, even the use of the English language, and certainly, as you said, political points of view and political emphasis. What is important in the political system of language? What we should acknowledge and what we should emphasize? Appealing to human content, appealing to human responsibility, appealing to community building, those kinds of influences. I had an interview with a gentleman last night, or occasion to have a discussion with a group of men last night, and I commented to one individual that was asking me after the fact about it. I said that those men have never before heard expressions like what we were giving them last evening. And the point was that because of that interaction with our thinking, it opened new areas of thinking for themselves. So non-Muslims looking at Muslims in America and considering their style of dress, they may not convert to Islam. They may not want Islam as religion for themselves, but it's something that they like about it. It's something that they like about the influence. So they will change the way that they dress, the way that they eat, the way that they dance, the way that they sing, etc., because they are appreciating this particular emphasis. So I would say that what we see presently that is dignified and reflects some kind of moral intelligence in the life of the African American people is not just on to the church influence, it's on also to the Muslim influence. One more minute. You young men, you don't have anything that you want to add? You're sitting on this silently. Yes.
What is the mission of Islam and doing today? What are you doing?
I'm here with you. I can't say that I represent the Nation of Islam. They have their own representation. But I understand what you mean. The work that we engage in now, I would think that it's no different from what we have always committed ourselves to. And that is the best representation and correct influence, the correct emphasis in Islam. What influence that Muhammad the Prophet wanted to be established as Islamic life and human life. And that is to respect and to inculcate a respect for the will of God and God's guidance. The will of God on human nature and an association and relationship with God's guidance. To lead that and to establish that and to bring it to its best expression, which is in a just environment, a just society that is honoring and paying tribute to human excellence wherever it is displayed. That's our work. That's an influence. Our words and our devotions are an influence on the thinking of leadership in the world. And a question was asked once of the wife of the Pope. I thought it pleased with her. And the question was about some prayers. And her answer was, she didn't answer the question about the prayers. The person was asking her about some technicality of the prayer. And her answer to this person was, do you read the Quran? And do you recite the Quran? And the person said, yes, of course. And she said, Muhammad is the Quran. His character is the Quran. So in other words, what are we doing? We want that what we say, what we do, how we live is a reflection of God's command and God's guidance. Paying respect to the dignity, the original dignity, inherent worth of human nature. Paying respect to that, not denying that, not setting that aside, but making that the edifice upon which the complement of God's guidance is established. And that's my work. So I guess the time is up. Thank you very much.